Welcome everybody. I'm Bobby Ross I'm the weekend plug-in columnist for Religion Unplugged. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Christian Chronicle. If I sound a little frazzled, it's because we did about 5 minutes of this before we realized we weren't actually live. So we had a little bit of a technical hijinks. So I apologize to anybody who was trying to get on here. I apologize to the panelists for wasting a little bit of your time. But I'm coming to you from Oklahoma City. We have a great expert group of panelists here this morning to talk about the COVID-19 vaccines and religion. Got some great topics to discuss. And I thought we would start with just having everybody on the panel just do a brief intro of themselves and where they're at, and then we'll just dive into the news and the questions. Megan, I guess we can start with you.
Hi everyone, I'm Megan Clark. I'm the managing editor at Religion Unplugged, and I'm based in New York, New York.
I'm Holly Meyer with the Tennessean. I cover religion here in Nashville.
Hi, I'm Clemente Lisi. I teach journalism at the King's College in New York City, and I cover Catholic issues for Religion Unplugged and Get Religion. And I'm here in Brooklyn, New York.
I'm Jack Jenkins. I'm a national reporter with Religion News Service, where I cover religion and politics and Catholicism, and often the overlap between the two. And I'm based in Washington, D.C.
Emil Harris. I'm also in Washington, D.C. And again, I cover the relationship between religion, politics, all of the above. And so been here about over 30 years, 40 years. It's a long time. Glad to be here today.
Well, glad to have you, Emil. Glad to have everybody here on the panel. I guess we'll just start with the big news this week related to the COVID-19 vaccines. It seems like maybe the way news goes these days is something that happened just a few days ago. It seems like a month ago. And that, to me, that's almost the case with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which I think received emergency authorization just over the weekend or close to the weekend. And seems like much longer than that, but big news has emerged on the religion beat just this week related to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and Catholic bishops and some concerns that have been expressed there about that vaccine. Jack, I know you've been all over that story. Can you talk a little bit about what the issues are there and what you've reported on that?
Sure. So last Friday, the Archdiocese of New Orleans issued a statement, or in between basically when the FDA panel and when the formal FDA, gave emergency approval for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And that statement argued that for Catholics in that Archdiocese, if given the choice between the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and say the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, the cleric implored those Catholics to choose something other than the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. The argument was that there were cells used in the production and the development of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that have a distant link to abortions that occurred in the 1980s, or like one particular abortion. And apparently, similar cell lines were actually also used in the development of Moderna and Pfizer, which they noted, those vaccines, but the link was more distant in theirs in terms of how much they use those cells. So they were offering this to Catholics in their region to say, again, if given the choice, you should choose something other than the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Well, that caused a spurt of news early this week. And then shortly thereafter, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops issued a similar statement that pressed more deeply into the idea that, hey, you can take the Johnson & Johnson vaccine if you don't have any options. But again, they came to the same conclusion, which is that if given the option, you should attempt to choose something other than the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, again, because of these cell lines. Since then, we have seen some other bishops issue similar statements, and actually in something in kind of contrast to that. Bishop McElroy of San Diego yesterday also issued a statement saying that it is morally permissible to take all 4 of the major vaccines that have been produced and are being distributed globally. So we're seeing, while that might technically be a difference of nuance, that there does seem to be a difference, significant rhetorical difference within the Catholic Church. And I will note that there was some question about how these statements might impact the distribution of the vaccine, given that Catholic parishes and Catholic hospitals and Catholic institutions are participating in vaccine distribution. And I called the Catholic Health Association to ask if these statements would change, anything for them, especially given that the Catholic Health Association had already released a statement before all of this saying that they believed the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was morally permissible to take. And they said in no uncertain terms to me that no, not only do the bishop's statements not change their own position on the vaccine, they also plan to distribute it and encourage the member hospitals within their large conglomerate of members to continue to distribute it, because they want as many people to have access to the vaccine as possible.
Interesting. Clemente, I know you follow Catholic issues. You've been following this story. What are you seeing happening here?
Yeah, no, I just want to say that, the truth is, unless you're a scientist, this is a very difficult thing to understand. And unless you have someone like Jack who can give you a concise 10-minute, or 5-minute understanding of what happened, or through his journalism, I think most people are getting this through headlines, through Twitter. And I think that it may cause some misunderstanding. It may start to feed into sort of the anti-vax movement a little bit, I think, too. And, Johnson & Johnson has an effective rate that's lower than the other vaccines, but it's also one shot as opposed to two. I think a lot of people favor the Johnson & Johnson. It's easier, you get one appointment. I know being in New York, it's very difficult to get an appointment, and I was able to get one for middle of April, but it didn't tell me what vaccine I would get. So, and sometimes in states where it's hard to get a vaccine, beggars can't be choosers. And I think these statements can put Catholics in a quandary, I think, and make them feel guilty or, not clearly understand, whether they should get this or not. And this is something I've been giving a lot of thought of, over the past year, is that I think the pandemic has shifted the pro-life debate in this country a little bit. Just from conversations I've had with friends and family who are Catholic and non. The idea is, if I can help stop spreading the virus, that is a pro-life thing. If I can help an elderly person not get sick, is that a pro-life thing? Not just the unborn, but kind of spreads out to society in general. I mean, think back to a year ago when First Things ran that very controversial piece about sort of, that people are going to die anyway, and we should keep everything open. And a lot of people on the pro-life side thought, wow, that's a very strange sort of philosophy to take if you're a Catholic or a Christian. But I do think these statements by the bishops cause a little bit of confusion, and I do think they'll trickle down to other denominations. I'm sure evangelicals and Orthodox Christians and other, maybe even the Hasidim, religious Jewish groups may start piggybacking on this. And we know some of those groups are already anti-vax. So I think statements come from a good place, but I think they may actually help feed some more conspiracy theories, which we don't need.
And I think you alluded to this as well, that the effective rate on mild cases of COVID-19 were less on Johnson & Johnson. Just maybe some of that's related to the different ways that they tested the virus, but you're already dealing with some people thinking maybe this is an inferior vaccine, even though my understanding is that all of them are close to 100% effective in preventing serious, deadly disease. But you add on top of that Catholic bishops and maybe other evangelical leaders casting some doubt on this vaccine, and suddenly that's creating issues. And then I think there was mention of the fact that in most cases you don't get to choose which vaccine you get. I know my wife has autoimmune diseases, and her doctor, vaccines are hard for her. So her doctor said, I want you to get Johnson & Johnson because it's one shot and we can try to make sure that's okay, instead of having to go twice and see what happens with two different vaccines. So she's got the challenge of trying to come up with Johnson & Johnson and get that. But
yeah, just to interject, Bobby, like if your wife was a devout Catholic and her bishop said, avoid this one, she wouldn't get vaccinated potentially. And that would mean the person out there not vaccinated. And we know that we want to try to create herd immunity. And so there's already enough anti-vaccine debate and discussion. And I'm afraid this could help feed that, even though it's not meant to. But it could be an inadvertent product of our time, in the way we get our news on social media. and just the conspiracy theories around vaccines that have been around for a long time already. So.
Right. Jack, do you have a feel for how mainstream the concerns are among Catholic bishops? Is it just a few bishops, or is it a lot of bishops that are raising concerns about that particular vaccine?
Well, I don't have exhaustive knowledge of all of the different bishops. I will note that the same two bishops that authored this statement that came out, from the USCCB, were also raising alarms about specifically the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, also known as the Janssen vaccine, because that's a subsidiary within them, back last summer. And that included other religious leaders, and particularly anti-abortion groups, also signed on to that letter. They sent a letter to the FDA raising concerns specifically about that vaccine. So concern about it isn't new. But the question of whether or not you would or should issue a statement that could, as has been pointed out, be misconstrued as a hard stop against it, which technically none of these statements do. There seems to be a lot of disagreement among the bishops about whether or not that is an appropriate choice. And I should note that most of these statements cite guidance from the Vatican, and the Vatican did release some general guidelines regarding this specific question about these cell lines, which ethicists have noted the cell lines that are actually used in the development and lab experiments are actually used pretty commonly are themselves not fetal cells. They are clones of clones of clones going back decades to those original lines. But the Vatican did release some guidance around this and actually said that it's morally permissible to take vaccines that have these within them, but did not name specific vaccines. And so you have this range of opinions expressed, particularly among the American bishops, where on the one hand, you have Bishop McElroy saying that you should be able to take all 4 vaccines, only 3 of which are available here in the United States. And then you also have bishops, at least one, who has said that that you shouldn't even take the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines because of their involvement with these cell lines. And so it's kind of speaks to how a lot of this might get mitigated diocese by diocese, as opposed to one statement truly speaking for the Catholic Church in general, or even here in the United States.
Interesting. Well, we can come back and talk more about this particular angle later, but Emil, I know you've been covering some other related issues to religion and COVID-19, particularly related to civil rights attorney Fred Gray and some advice he's given to an African-American church in Baltimore, I think via video over the weekend. Can you talk a little bit about that issue and what you're seeing there?
And I want to do that, Bobby, but I want to make a caveat that with the Catholics, all of this is part of the American infrastructure. It's like when they laid the railroad tracks. And unfortunately, there is a component called race that takes us, that connects a Fred Gray to a archbishop of a Catholic church, because we have seen historically that they used to say in the Black community, if the whites have a cold, we get the flu. And so what has happened is that historically speaking, there was a time in our country where you had experimentation. And one of the most famous was the Tuskegee experiment in terms of syphilis. And what happened is that men of color were given syphilis. And some had, I don't know all the details, but some had placebo, but they were basically guinea pigs back in the 40s and 50s. Fred Gray, who's a civil rights lawyer, as you know, worked with Rosa Parks and a lot of other people, Dr. King, is from Tuskegee, Alabama. And so here we have in Baltimore this Black History Month program, which is normally, because it's a member of the Church of Christ, it's, hey, you just tell some war stories and ask the little kids questions. But it came at the time in Baltimore where this whole the vaccine situation is in getting the COVID vaccine. And what's happening is that while the Ravens football stadium, instead of having football and stuff, is one of the main hubs to get the COVID vaccine. And what we're seeing is that people are coming from the suburbs across the state of Maryland and getting the vaccine, where inner city Baltimore people, African Americans, are not getting it. There are 2 things going on. one of the things is because of how the distribution, who has the internet, who doesn't have the internet, but also there is still a fear factor that once again, will African Americans get a placebo versus the real thing? And will they just be guinea pigs? And so here we have 50, 60 years, this is 2020, and we're going back almost 70 years to the same issues of race and the disproportionality when it comes down to distribution of medical stuff. And so I think when we look at this whole piece, from the Capitol insurrection to today, we're dealing with America in a tale of two stories. That makes sense.
And I guess to tie it back to the religion angle of it, part of the concern, obviously, that you mentioned with the African American community is that there's that experiment that Fred Gray was involved in. What did he tell this church over the weekend as far as whether to connect those two things together?
Very bluntly, he said, don't connect it. He says, what happened in Tuskegee was a travesty that people of color were targeted for experimentation to come up with a solution. And Baltimore, what he was saying is that this country did not create the COVID-19 virus. It did not. The government didn't. The government's trying to deal with it. Take the vaccine. He could be more just, take the vaccine. It's okay. But even with all that declaration, you still had young people asking questions. Are you sure? But why can't we? So he basically was Anthony Fauci in the church. So you have this push. And I still think we must ask why now? Because you had such a distrust, unfortunately, in the African American community with President Trump. President Trump is gone. Joseph Biden is the president, but yet you have more media coverage of what happened at the CPAC convention and what's Trump's next move even today. Right now, I'm monitoring the US Capitol because somebody was expecting something going to happen today because of Trump, but he's gone. But it shows you the challenge of the president being the cheerleader in chief or whatever in terms of fear in this country. And there is serious fear in the African American community and concern about, will this vaccine really help us? And meanwhile, last point, in Southeast DC right now, one of the members of our church organization is in charge of giving out vaccines. And what's happening is that non-African Americans, this is a poor section of the city, people are showing up, whites are showing up because they got emails from their family members in Texas. Hey, go there, they have plenty of vaccines. So you go there, you can get your shot. And now the city of Washington is trying to figure this out where you got to have a geographic, this just happened since yesterday. We need to see your ID to see if you're really a Washington, DC resident. So it shows you the intensity of this vaccine and the racial implications that's going on right now.
So there's skepticism, and then there's also access issues for people who are willing to get a vaccine. And then there's skepticism in the African American community, and then there's, I guess, skepticism among a lot of white conservative Christians who kind of, in their circles, there's doubts have been cast on the vaccine. So it gets real complicated, it sounds like. Holly, I know you've reported on some of the issues with the vaccine there in Nashville. Could you maybe talk a little bit about what you're seeing and what some of the issues are from your perspective?
Absolutely. In terms of jumping off of the concerns in the Black community, I have talked to a couple of the Black pastors here in town who are intentionally public with their decision to get vaccinated, including one pastor who leads First Baptist Capitol Hill, which played a historic role in Nashville's civil rights fight. It's Kelly Miller Smith Jr. His dad was an icon in the movement here in Nashville. He put on social media photos of him getting vaccinated. That was on Saturday, and then on Sunday, he was in the pulpit saying, hey, I went and got vaccinated, and just talked about the easy experience that he went through at Meharry Medical College, which is a historically Black college in town that has been leading our COVID testing here in the city in Nashville. And in terms of the access issues, one of the concerns that was raised right away was that Meharry Medical College was initially left off of the first wave of vaccines in the city. So that was rectified by another hospital chain sharing some of their allotment with that college. And so those issues are definitely playing out here in Nashville. I will say that, like, broadly, vaccine hesitancy is something that we're seeing play out in the city or in the state. We are moving quicker to the next phase of vaccines because there is a lack of demand in rural communities. And depending upon what survey you look at, you're seeing certainly vaccine hesitancy among Black Americans, but you're also seeing vaccine hesitancy among Republicans. And outside of the core cities in the state, Tennessee is really red. It's also really conservative, or not really conservative, it's really Christian. So I don't have any numbers to back up whether or not there is a link between those two, but we do know that at least the red state might have some sort of correlation to that hesitancy.
Interesting.
Can I just chime in what she just said? Isn't it ironic, and Megan knows what I'm talking about. We did articles in Religion Unplugged about John Lewis, about Nashville, about civil rights. When I was a child, we would go to Nashville like going to New York City. And then it's interesting, that line between Lewis, who went to Fisk, which is next door to Meharry, goes straight to Washington, D.C., race, politics, culture, Marshall Keeble, Jackson Avenue with Church of Christ, right there, same thing. The Bible Belt. It really is an exciting time to cover faith, you know.
Exactly.
Yeah, on that, it is a really cool city to get to cover. And the late C.T. Vivian also went to American Baptist College here in town with John Lewis. So yeah, it's like walking history everywhere you go. But you're right, those threads are still present today. And some of the conversations you can link back to those conversations that we're having decades ago.
How big a role and anybody can jump in here, do you expect the religious community to play as we get to the point where there are a lot of vaccines? And to this point, I know I think we're at the point still where people who want a vaccine are kind of scrambling to try to get an appointment. I was real excited to get my first shot a couple of weeks ago. Jack, I think you had breaking news on Twitter today about getting an appointment. I'm wondering, I think what I understand is we're probably going to get to the point soon where there's more vaccine than there are people scrambling to get appointments. Do you expect the religious community to play a role in kind of getting people to get vaccinated? What do y'all see happening there?
I'll just jump in real quick, and I think it's
Sure.
going to vary depending on places. I will just note that top line stuff, we were reporting back in this November, December, that a lot of faith communities are deeply invested in helping with the distribution of the vaccine. I know in New York State alone, they have hundreds of churches that have already offered, and that the governor and the city of New York have already in conversation with as serving as vaccination distribution centers, which is one of the reasons this whole discourse around the Catholic Church is important, because Catholic churches have been a big part of both COVID testing sites as well as distribution centers. And that's just as a practical matter. If you look up, many different states and cities have, something Baptist church or, different churches that will serve as places where people go and get vaccines. And that's a very strategic and intentional move by a lot of local, state, and federal health departments. In addition to that, when we're talking about this vaccine hesitancy, there are several different faith-rooted issues regarding vaccine hesitancy. I interviewed an Orthodox rabbi a few months ago who intentionally participated in the Moderna trial as a way of combating vaccine hesitancy within the Orthodox Jewish community. There are also, there's this difference between the vaccine hesitancy that Hamil was talking about, which has this very specific historic tie. And I'll note that Wilton Gregory, the Archbishop here in Washington, and the first African-American cardinal, he spoke specifically to that the history is real and that concern is different than what we're finding in some other white Christian communities, which is just straight up conspiracy theories regarding the vaccine. And so those are requiring a different kind of approach to kind of discuss and help dispel that kind of more anti-vaxxer sentiment, which is different and distinct from vaccine hesitancy. And then, of course, on top of that is the science around it, like the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, as y'all were saying earlier, the numbers it reported were less efficacious than Moderna and Pfizer, but we can't actually compare them because Johnson & Johnson was conducting a lot of its research in South Africa, which had a different strain. So we were not even able to get a full comparison between whether it's any more or less efficacious. And so all of those pieces of information I've seen are coming out of the mouths of local faith leaders who are trying to talk to this. And so I see like Holly wanted to say something about this as well.
Yeah, I just want to say I'm impressed with Jack using the word efficacious because I didn't dare attempt that. But go ahead, Holly.
I just wanted to echo some of what he said, which is while I haven't talked to anybody yet about them being willing to do this, we did see Meharry Medical College partner with Black churches to increase COVID testing in minority communities in the city. So if there is a willingness to do that, there is already an infrastructure in place within the city to make that happen. I also suspect we will continue to see clergy using their public-facing position to say, hey, look at me, I got a vaccine, potentially trying to help navigate the complicated process of signing up for vaccines. The rollout in Tennessee has been pretty slower than other parts of America. And there's a variety of factors for that. We did just have an unusual ice storm, but I think but then also we just had one of our most famous residents get vaccinated. Dolly Parton, she gave $1 million to research at Vanderbilt University. And so this week she got vaccinated on video and that was disseminated broadly. And so I would imagine we'll continue to see more people rolling up their sleeves publicly in the religious community, probably in some sort of active role, at least within their congregations, on education, attempting to dispel what they can, listening to concerns, and trying to help people make that decision, in addition to continuing to connect them to appointments and navigate what that process is like.
And Holly's doing it too. Think about it, and I keep going back to this epicenter. Don't think that this is the 2024 election already starting, because when you think about evangelicals who was clearly in the Trump camp, and the Catholics, a lot of Catholics were kind of split. And then you got the United Methodists versus the African Methodist Episcopals. So you have these groups, and the Democrats are having a tough time to try to, to have whatever the loyal base was, even among African Americans. So Joe Biden, if he had a honeymoon, I think it's over. And I think right now, everyone's grabbing for that faith vote. And these are issues that are that's on the table. And it's just very interesting.
Just jump in with a question for anyone who wants to answer it now. But one thing, we've been talking a lot about clergy, and I think we're all aware that clergy are maybe losing a little bit of their authority with a lot of religious communities that are looking at social media influencers, all kinds of forums that are maybe more democratic and less authority driven. So, and some of those have a lot of misinformation. So does anyone want to answer, what is the mark of the beast, and why are some groups connecting that to the COVID vaccine? And we've seen this like on TikTok videos. There are Christian influencers that act out like, I got the COVID vaccine and died, and these kind of seemingly crazy scenarios, but some people really believe this. So what is their perspective? Why are they connecting that from the book of Revelation?
It's getting quiet here.
Well, so
mean,
I go ahead.
No, I was saying, I remember, I want to brag, but I'm glad I went to two types of seminaries. One with the Church of Christ Harding, the other was Evangelical Capital Bible Seminary, which was part of Dallas Theological Seminary. And that whole thing about Revelation, Tim LaHaye, the beast, the end time events, this is like living in time. And so you have people who have this very strong belief system that we're just Revelation and that, is right there. Here we are. And they see their whole worldview is through this window. And so you got to square those beliefs versus other beliefs. And it just seems like there must be some big summit being planned of faith leaders, because a lot of people are just not buying it. But then folks are just confused. And the Sunday morning preacher is being challenged by the social media preacher that goes 24/7.
Mm-hmm. And to that point, I will confess that the mark of the beast ideology is new to me. It was something that my editor and I started talking about a few weeks ago, and I was like, "What?" And like, I grew up in the Southeast, in a more mainline community, but surrounded by evangelicalism, and it hadn't come up in my culture. But my understanding, and anyone jump in if they know more about this than I do, that this was a popular narrative, the idea that the mark of the beast would be part of the apocalyptic vision in terms that is attached to one interpretation of the book of Revelation, when it comes to that's like this signal, that this part of this apocalyptic scenario where you don't want the mark of the beast, right? And so this has been, and then there have been many different theories over the years about what would constitute the mark of the beast, what new thing might end up being that. And it seems to be that the vaccine is connected to that at this point, where if it's the ones that you're talking about, Megan, it's these TikTok videos where somebody acts out as if they don't want the vaccine, and they get the vaccine, and then suddenly they are given the mark of the beast. And I do know that these often get connected to existing more, for lack of a better term, secular conspiracy theories, such as the false baseless claim that somehow Bill Gates is going to inject us all with microchips with these sorts of vaccines. And so that you will often find in some of these communities that these two different, arguably worldviews or articulations of reality get intermixed. Where I have heard people discuss the Bill Gates theory and the mark of the beast ideology at the same time. And so for an average faith, I mean, I've seen some evangelical pastors, even as early as last year, give sermons trying to dissuade people from engaging with conspiracy theories. And I mean, there was one pastor actually from my hometown by happenstance who preached this idea that that if he says, if you don't believe in these conspiracy theories, you must be a sheep. And he argued, well, I am a sheep. I'm a sheep for Christ. And instilled this idea into his congregation. But I think that's what a lot of these different pastors are facing when they kind of encounter things like the mark of the beast ideologies. It's not just that. It's all these other conspiracy theories that have found new relevance and new height of sharing than we haven't seen in several years. And I've heard at least one expert say that they expect that part of the reason for the preponderance of conspiracy theories is precisely because of the pandemic, that it has increased their spread. So it's a lot for an average faith leader to combat in one sermon.
And I think it's probably me talking about science is probably not the best thing in the world, but I did report in one story on vaccines that I think one of the specific reasons that the mark of the beast issue is coming up is because of the specific type of technology that's used on the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine. It's called mRNA or messenger RNA, and it's a new technology that I'm reading from a story, injects a piece of genetic code for the spike protein that coats the coronavirus. The mRNA induces the body to produce harmless spike protein enough to spike the immune system to react if it later encounters the real virus. And my understanding is that's a new technology, and some people have kind of drawn a connection between that and you're not just injecting a new technology, you're injecting like a mark inside your body. And right, there are various religious leaders who kind of explain that if that's really not what Revelation is saying, but still that whole idea is out there. And
well, I will only add just this one tidbit, which is that ironically, one of the reasons I wrote about this, the more recent statements from the bishops, is because I was speaking to in one of our editorial meetings that I had heard anecdotally that one of the reasons that some anti-vaxxers are excited about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is precisely because it is not an mRNA vaccine. And that there was like this energy around it, like, oh, this is a real vaccine as opposed to the others. So that comes full circle on that one. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut anybody off.
Oh, no, that's great. Megan, are we getting any questions at all on Facebook? I know we had some technical difficulties, so I don't know if anybody's watching live or not.
The floor is open for anyone.
I just want to jump in and mention, I think, it's kind of like the pandemic meets a culture war on this. Like, 6 months ago, Democrats or people on the left were calling it the Trump vaccine, right? The moment Trump loses, the other side is like moving on from QAnon, and now they're all in on this other conspiracy theory. So it's kind of just bizarre to see politics infuse so much influence over people's decisions. I mean, the truth is that we were able to come up with a vaccine 6 to 9 months, a year after the pandemic. It's an extraordinary scientific achievement. It's like putting a man on the moon, but that's been all overshadowed by the fact that, social media now has more influence than your local clergyman. And I will say in terms of the Catholic Church has lost a lot of influence because of the child sex abuse scandal of the past 3 decades. And I do also believe that in a lot of poor communities in this country, in communities of color, the Catholic Church isn't there anymore because churches closed, they had to be sold off, there aren't enough priests. So I do think, Catholic schools had to be shuttered. So I do think that influence on the ground is gone. And so your average 15-year-old will spend more time on their iPhone than playing basketball, that's overseen by like a Christian brother or a Catholic priest who coaches a team. That would have been the case in 1950 or 1960. So I really do think that we're in a perilous place, but I do think that once most people are vaccinated, there'll be another conspiracy theory that people will gravitate to, and then we'll be talking about that in 6 months. So, it is kind of disheartening, but I think that's the job. Our job is to try to cut through that noise the best we can, and hopefully we're doing that.
Clemente, you just said something that made me think. When I was a child, I knew Father Merritt. And again, I wasn't Catholic, but we knew the Catholics will feed you. You got basketball, they would come and get you. And it was like, that was the hangout. But it's amazing, not just the Catholics, the Baptists, the church, other faith groups are losing the influence so rapidly. And this I call it the COVID factor, the Zoom factor. A lot of people I've talked to don't really want to go back to that building, that brick and mortar. And a lot of people now church surf. They hit your service and they hit 3 other services. And people are using Zelle and stuff to pay. So I think we're looking at a historic shift, because we used to go to church with the sermon, the choir, food and fellowship, or whatever. And now, or just the singing, now we go to Zoom, and then now what will we do? Continue to serve other things. So I do think long-term, there's a historical shift going on, and none of us really know where this is headed.
I agree with that. And often when you make that case to a younger generation, you come across as like, get off my lawn kind of guy. Or, I think baby boomers and Gen Xers are in this category where they're aligned against millennials and Gen Z, who are, I think you're right, a lot of them don't want to go back to normal. I think they think this is okay. They can be on Zoom, spend all day in their pajamas and live this life. Well, I think most of us here are looking forward to doing a panel like this in person someday. But I do think a lot of people have fallen into this trap of relying on their iPhones. And I don't know that, the conspiracy theories are gonna win out on the phone, because they're just more attractive and kind of help shape people's worldview. So I don't know where we go from here, but it's a disheartening thing.
I will add that when I have covered the Mark of the Beast, it has been around new developments of technologies as they interact with like the human body. I'm thinking of the story I did a couple years ago where there was a vending machine company that wanted to implant like the little pay chip in your hands. You just like swiped it and you could get your chips and your soda or whatever. So that kind of rose then. I recall my predecessor at the Religion News Service, Bob Smetana, or he's Religion News Service now, he wrote about this, I believe it was the Mark of the Beast, I think 666 being incorporated into an employee ID. There's another case that I believe made it to court about biometric hand screening in an employee. So it does kind of make sense that this would sort of flare up again as we're dealing with new science, new technology, a lot of unknowns, and especially as it goes like into the body kind of thing. So I will say that. I will add one piece of news that came out of Tennessee this week is that there was a piece of legislation attempting to broaden the religious exemption for being able to decline vaccines. If I'm recalling this correctly, you have that religious exception except for in a pandemic. The subcommittee for the state legislature, and I must underscore the fact that our lawmakers are very Christian. It's not what kind of religion you are, it's like which Christian tradition do you belong to? So there were members of that subcommittee who are active members of their churches. One of the examples they were using was, well, if I'm at a Southern Baptist daycare, are you saying that if I have an immunocompromised kid, I can't require this other kid to get a vaccine? So that language is being played out at the policymaking process, and ultimately they knocked that bill down. That bill died. There are other non-specific religious vaccination exemptions and other COVID exemptions, kind of like pushing back on government authority or employee or business owner authority. So we'll continue to see how that plays out. But that kind of tug of war between public welfare and religious liberty is going to continue to be a part of our policymaking discussions as we see state legislatures tackle these issues.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the religious exemptions for vaccinations has been a big thing for years, I guess. And what you're saying is COVID has brought a new twist to that as far as specific exemptions to COVID-19 vaccines.
Yes.
And I will echo an interesting thing about Clemente earlier about the political element of that, in that we have now learned, if you recall, the insurrectionist with the horns and face paint, he is in jail and being after being charged by the FBI. And in addition to him, having to actually change jails because he believes that his religion, which seems to be a syncretic religion that both involves what he claims to be shamanism as well as elements of Christianity, he can only eat organic food, and he was granted that exemption. He actually moved to a different jail to get that. He also is refusing to be vaccinated for also by citing religious reasons. And again, these intermingle pretty intensely with QAnon, as he also goes by the name the Q shaman. And so I think that we're going to see, it's interesting though, right? Because that is a religious belief, and that is going to be something that it'll be interesting to see how many people claim if vaccination becomes something that a large group of people are, again, not just hesitant about, but actively have anti-vaccination sentiment towards.
And you brought up a very interesting concept. If you think about QAnon, you think about the guy with the horns, and even with the Proud Boys, it was interesting that one of the leaders of the Proud Boys was Afro-Cuban or someone of mixed race that we would call in the streets a brother, whatever. And so, and it shows you how we're not so monolithic of white and black. That narrative could work probably for the last time with the Trump-Biden election. But now you have so many voices. You have a lot of young people who are really searching out themselves, like what do they believe? And even at this point, people are, when I was out there, and you can see the Proud Boys, you can see this, there was a lot of mixing up. I talked to, now I know the QAnon, the Proud, everybody, people like, what's your name? Where are you from? It's like a convention of something. And I think going forward, people are really I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of searching out people's belief systems and where do we go.
And just to add to that, I was at the Jericho March outside the Capitol the day before the insurrection, and there was conspiracy theories about the pandemic that were said in the same breath as, worship of Jesus Christ, right? And we've seen recent surveys from the American Enterprise Institute that around a little more than a quarter of white evangelicals actually ascribe to the core QAnon conspiracy theory. You also find elements within, sizable elements within white mainline and white Catholic communities in those same pieces. And I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, with that QAnon shaman being granted that religious exemption for a religious reason, with this faith that seems very new and alien to a lot of Americans. But if we're seeing these as part of the religious milieu in the United States, it'll be an interesting question how the courts and how lawmakers respond to that as a faith position. Even Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was unapologetic for a while there about the interspersing her political beliefs with QAnon theories, has also been very deeply expressive about a Christian faith. And so I just think it'll be interesting, like you said, with these different forms of, or at least expressions of faith, we already see them interacting with this pandemic. And even post-pandemic, what will they look like and how will courts react to them? There doesn't seem to be an easy answer to that.
Well, we are getting close to out of time. We've got a couple of minutes. Anybody is there any issue related to religion and COVID-19 that you thought, hey, we should have covered that or asked about that before we sign off? I think we've covered a pretty wide range of things.
I just think access still, I'm still back. I have, you guys, most of you had 1 or 2 tests. I'm still waiting for the first one. And I have friends that, we can hook you. I said, no, I want to go when I'm invited. Can I go? On the table, not because I know somebody down the street come at 3 o'clock and maybe we can get you in through the back door. I mean, that's like what the drug trail was about. With marijuana, it's like, some folks have regular medicine, then the brothers have to deal with heroin and opiates. Didn't we just go through 100 years of that? So here we go now. This seems like the vaccination is going more to the black market than to the front door. So that's just an issue I was on my mind.
Well, appreciate that, Hamil. Appreciate all the panelists for joining us with your great expertise. I write the weekend plug-in column for Religion Unplugged, which you can subscribe via Substack. And you also can read it at religionunplugged.com on Fridays. We'll have a little summary of this discussion. We'll have the YouTube video for anybody who missed the whole thing. We'll link to what Jack's written this week. We'll link to what Hamil's written and some other Holly's stories. And just really appreciate the panel. Appreciate everybody taking the time to join us. And I guess we'll sign off for now. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.